Nothing forced me to stay. That's the part I avoided saying for a long time. I told myself there were obligations, circumstances, expectations. I told myself I had responsibilities that made leaving impossible, that staying was the only reasonable option. And in many ways, that felt true. But over time, I realized something uncomfortable. Nothing actually forced me. There were pressures. There were consequences. There were risks. But there was no lock, no door I couldn't open, no rule that said I wasn't allowed to choose differently. I stayed because staying felt safer than not knowing. I stayed because leaving would have required explaining myself to others, to myself. I stayed because it was easier to accept what already existed than to step into something undefined. That doesn't make me weak. It makes me human. But it does mean something important. I wasn't trapped. I was participating. For a long time, I confused difficulty with impossibility. I assumed that because something would be hard, it wasn't really an option. I assumed that because something would disrupt stability, it was irresponsible. So I stopped treating it as a choice. I labeled it unrealistic, impractical, not worth considering. And once something is labeled that way, you stop engaging with it. It fades from your decision making without ever being officially rejected. That's how staying becomes invisible. I didn't wake up each day and decide to stay. I simply didn't decide to leave. And over time, that felt like the same thing, but it isn't. Staying by default and staying by choice feel very different internally. One carries intention, the other carries inertia. I lived with inertia for a long time. It didn't feel like resistance. It felt like continuity. Days followed days. Years followed years. Nothing collapsed. Nothing demanded immediate change. And because nothing was broken, I assumed nothing needed to be questioned. But comfort can be persuasive. It doesn't argue. It doesn't pressure. It just quietly suggests that whatever you're doing now is good enough to continue. I accepted that suggestion without examining it. I told myself I was being realistic, that I was avoiding unnecessary risk, that I was protecting what I had built. Those things weren't false, they just weren't the whole truth. The truth was simpler. I stayed because I didn't want to feel uncertain. Uncertainty felt like failure, like immaturity, like going backward. I had worked hard to build a life that felt stable. And why would I disrupt that? So I stayed. Not out of fear exactly, more out of habit. Habit is powerful. It shapes your sense of what's possible without ever announcing itself. I didn't notice how much agency I had given up because I hadn't given it up dramatically. I had just stopped exercising it. I treated my current situation as if it were permanent, as if it were the natural end point of all the decisions that came before it. That assumption was convenient. It removed responsibility. It removed doubt. It removed the need to ask difficult questions. But it also removed something else. Honesty. I wasn't being dishonest with others. I was being dishonest with myself. I told myself I had no choice, because acknowledging choice would have meant acknowledging discomfort. It would have meant admitting that I was actively choosing something that didn't fully align with me anymore. That's a hard thing to admit. It's much easier to believe that circumstances made the decision for you. I believed that for a long time. until I started paying attention to how often I used language that removed myself from the equation. I have to. I can't. There's no other option. Those phrases sound neutral, responsible, adult, but they also create distance. They suggest that life is happening to you, not through you. I realized that many of the things I said I had to do were things I continued doing because they were familiar, because they were manageable, because they allowed me to avoid uncertainty. Nothing forced me to stay. What kept me there was the absence of a clear alternative, and the assumption that without a clear alternative, you shouldn't move. I treated clarity as a prerequisite for choice, but clarity rarely comes before movement. It comes after. I was waiting for certainty before allowing myself to reconsider. That wait could have lasted forever. I also told myself that leaving would hurt people, that it would disappoint, that it would create instability. And that was true. But staying also had consequences. They were just quieter. They showed up as distance, as disengagement, as a subtle sense of living beside my life instead of inside it. Those consequences were harder to explain, so I didn't give them much weight, but they mattered. I realized that staying wasn't neutral. It was an active choice with active effects. I had just been pretending otherwise. That realization didn't push me to leave. It didn't create urgency. What it created was ownership. For the first time, I stopped saying, "I'm here because I have no choice," and started saying, "I'm here because I've chosen this so far." That shift changed how everything felt. Not lighter, more honest. When you acknowledge choice, you regain relationship with your life, even if you don't change anything immediately. I didn't suddenly want something else. I didn't suddenly know where I would go, but I stopped lying to myself about why I was where I was, and that mattered more than I expected. It returned agency without requiring action. I could stay without pretending I was forced. I could leave without pretending it was betrayal. Both became possible again. I realized that choice doesn't demand movement. It demands acknowledgement. You don't have to act on every option for it to be real. But denying that options exist changes how you experience your life. It turns participation into obligation. I had lived too long inside that framing. I had told myself that recognizing choice would destabilize everything. But it didn't. It clarified things. It showed me that staying, when acknowledged as a choice, felt different. It felt cleaner, less resentful, less heavy. I could see what I was actually valuing: stability, continuity, familiarity. Those weren't wrong. They just weren't automatic anymore. I was allowed to value them consciously instead of hiding behind necessity. Nothing forced me to stay. And realizing that didn't make me want to leave immediately. It made me present. It made me attentive. It made me aware of the quiet negotiations I had been avoiding with myself. I stopped asking, "Why can't I leave?" and started asking, "Why am I staying?" That question doesn't demand an answer right away. It just asks to be considered. I learned that many people stay not because they are trapped, but because they are waiting for permission. Permission to change. Permission to question. Permission to want something different. I realized I had been waiting for certainty, waiting for validation, waiting for a reason that felt big enough. But nothing forced me to stay. And nothing was going to force me to leave either. The responsibility was quieter than that. It was simply mine. And once I acknowledged that, I stopped feeling stuck, even though nothing had changed yet. Because being stuck and being still are not the same thing. One is denial, the other is awareness. I wasn't trapped, I was choosing. And now at least I knew it.